Hey everybody, I'm homesick. I hope you're being good. I'll be back tomorrow. So at least that's my plan, but no, really, I'll be back tomorrow. I got some medicine, so that should help. Um, so what you're going to do right now is I need you to pull out your notes from Monday. The notes from Monday look like this. Progressive Presidents 8-2. If you were gone Monday, the sub hopefully has some extra copies on my lab table. If not, you can just write these down, on paper. Look through your folder, hopefully you have them. And remember, we're talking about Theodore Roosevelt as kind of our classic progressive president. We watched his video clip on Monday. On Monday, we got through number 3, this supported farmers. So we're picking it up today with number 4 and number 5. Go ahead and cross out part D. So take your pencil, cross out part D. Part D was just a review. We were just going to review his foreign policy. We'll do that here next week when we're reviewing for the final. So it's just stuff we learned last chapter about, imperialism, Roosevelt corollary, walk softly and carry a big stick with big stick diplomacy, that kind of stuff, building up our Navy, pro-imperialism, all that. So we're going to just talk about his other progressive policies. We talked about his economic things on Monday. He didn't do a whole lot for politics, but remember those constitutional amendments of 16 through 19 are getting passed during this time. So we're really talking more about social reforms today with 4 and 5. All right, so let's look at number 4. So for number 4, I want you to take a look at, trying to figure out what I did with number 4. Here we go. All right, sorry about that. I had to get to the right slide. So let's look at 4A. And for 4A, you're going to write something down about how Gifford Pinchot, he is Theodore Roosevelt's best buddy, and he creates the word conservation. So next to 4A, you're going to write something down about how Gifford Pinchot, that's his friend's name, he created the term conservation. And they talked about this the other day in the video, that Theodore Roosevelt was an interesting man, that he was definitely contradictory in many ways. For example, he was someone who loved hunting, but at the same time, he, wanted to protect the environment at all costs. So in many ways, people would see him as destructive because he wanted to obviously poach animals, go on safari, things like that, and hunt. Yet he loved America, he loved the wide open spaces, and his buddy and him were talking, and they said, we need to conserve America's natural beauty, its landscapes, its resources. So write something down about conserving resources. Now for B, you're going to write something down about how, remember, the progressive era is about getting laws passed to fix problems. So to protect America's landscape and make sure that it isn't all turned into big cities with skyscrapers and factories and shopping malls, he gets Congress to pass the Forest Reserve Act. So write something down about how the Forest Reserve Act is passed, and it puts 100 million acres of land basically for, hunting, camping, just protected natural wildlife areas so animals can live, trees can be protected, flowers, etc. So write something down for the Forest Reserve Act about 100 million acres we're going to be protected as part of our forest system, hunting, camping, fishing, natural wildlife areas, etc. Now next up for C, for national parks, you're going to write down that he was the one that helped create the Grand Canyon. So there's many different national parks in the United States. Here's just a map where you can see just, several different ones. Maybe you've been camping or to some of these like Great Smoky Mountains or Cumberland Gap or Shenandoah, the Everglades, Yellowstone, things like that. Those have all been created because of efforts of, the work that's first started with President Roosevelt. So write something down about how he was the one who helped, starting protect landscape for national parks that would be protected forever, and he helped create the Grand Canyon. So if you've ever been there, you can thank him. It's on my bucket list to go see it one day. And then last but not least, for the environment, you're going to write something down about how his buddy, John Muir, He is all about protecting our natural resources. And you can see in the pictures here, here is TR with his friend Pinchot, who helped create the term conservation. And then John Muir, you can also write down, he is part of his cabinet. So he's his group of advisors. And Muir is, really like adamant on getting these laws passed, like, to protect the Grand Canyon, to set up land for, the Forest Reserve Act, to make sure that there is America the beautiful for future generations, that we don't lose that feeling, that sense of self, all this beautiful land and wilderness and natural habitat. So just to review there, make sure you got Pinchot coins conservation, creates a new word. The Forest Reserve Act puts 100 million acres of land on the side to be protected. National Parks helps create the Grand Canyon. And Muir was one of TR's best buddies, part of his cabinet, and helped get these laws passed, because remember, that's the goal of all these progressive muckrakers, to bring about change. Now let's talk about consumer protection. The other big thing that Teddy Roosevelt changes in America is creating safer food safety standards. And you're going to write something down about how Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle. So write something down about how Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle, and it showed how bad the conditions were in the meatpacking plant. Now, I'm hoping that yesterday with your group, you read some of the primary sources from The Jungle. And they talked about how, if you have a meatpacking plant, that's going to attract rodents. So mice and rats would be attracted to the meat and try to come and eat it, and they'd get stuck in the machinery, and then they would die, and they would get ground up with the meat. The machines would get stuck, and humans would try to, unclog them, and then they would lose fingers, and that would get just ground up with the meat. It was disgusting. And Upton Sinclair wrote about all this in his book, and I'm hoping you did the questions and turned them in. And if you were gone yesterday, make sure you talk to the sub, you get the worksheets, you can get those questions done. So Upton Sinclair was hoping when he wrote the book that he would change America, but not in the way you might think. Sinclair was actually a socialist, like a communist, like we've talked about. And he was hoping that once he exposed, the long hours, the unsafe conditions, the poor wages, it would spur on an American revolution, and people would push for change and support socialism and equality in America. But that's not what happened. Theodore Roosevelt and many others read the work of this muckraker, and they said, no, this is disgusting. Like you can see in the political cartoon there. This was a huge scandal. We need to get laws passed immediately to get safer food. So for the Pure Food and Drug Act, you're going to write something down about how a law was passed where this government agency, right? Today we have, the Food and Drug Administration. They're going to start inspecting what is in your food and what were in tonics or medicines back then. Because obviously there was talk. What was the secret in, Coca-Cola? Was it cocaine? People would be taking hair tonics. They would take things and drink potions and put things on their body, and they would say they'll make you bald or they'll make you skinny, or I should say not bald, but your hair would grow back. And there would be all sorts of different chemicals, some of them poisonous, that people would be injecting in their body. And of course, they would not be giving them the desired effects. So write something down about how the Pure Food and Drug Act would be inspecting these different foods, tonics, medicines that were coming out to make sure that they were doing what they claimed and they didn't actually cause other health problems. And then last but not least, for the Meat Inspection Act, okay, write something down about how your meat would be inspected. Okay, so just to sum up that part, Sinclair's book, The Jungle, wrote about the unsafe conditions in the meatpacking plant. The Pure Food and Drug Act was to make sure that, the government was actually putting what they claimed in your actual, food and medicines, and people were not trying to scam you or, hurt you just in the, effort to make money. And the Meat Inspection Act was now your meat would be inspected to make sure it was safer, there was no other animal or human parts in there. All right, so we're done with that page of notes talking about Teddy Roosevelt. So at this point, you can put that page away, but the sub is going to pass out, if they haven't already yet, the new page of notes. So you're going to get the new page of notes here, so you can put that other page to the side. So the new page of notes that you should have gotten should look like this. And you can actually, hopefully everybody has this page. If you don't, raise your hand, make sure you get one. We're going to cross out the information in the top left corner. Cross out everything about Teddy Roosevelt. We're not going to do anything on Teddy Roosevelt right now. We're just going to do information on Taft and maybe on Wilson. We'll see how long my voice can hold out. So cross out the stuff on Teddy Roosevelt. We already did that. We don't need to review it. We just finished it. Okay, so let's move to Taft. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about President Taft. So President Taft won the election in 1908 because he was endorsed by Roosevelt. So go ahead and obviously fill in the boxes as I put them up here. Now, a lot of people will say that William Howard Taft was not a great president, but honestly, he was. I kind of want you to just, on the side of your page somewhere, I want you to add these accomplishments, which I have added here off to the right. So, for example, we know that he was a good president. For example, he was the true trust buster. He actually ends up busting way more trusts than Teddy Roosevelt. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt was the trust regulator. And half the time he would say that, oh, this is a good trust, I'll leave it alone. But are there really any good trusts? That's a pretty bold statement to make. Taft broke apart way more trusts than Roosevelt ever did. He was a big supporter of the common man, of improving America, fixing its problems. One of the problems he also really wanted to fix, and you need to add this to your page as well, here on Taft's accomplishments, just kind of add them around this box somewhere, is he creates an organization called the Children's Bureau. And the Children's Bureau is an organization which is trying to end child labor in America. They started to investigate companies that were hiring child laborers, and they wanted to make it difficult for those organizations to sell their goods to other companies, to Americans, to trade goods across the country. They were eventually kind of shut down. The government basically at this time, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, said Americans want child labor. You're interfering with business too much in terms of laissez-faire economics. We're just going to allow child labor for now. And obviously it's morally objectionable, but they said that, they didn't really have the rights to interfere and control interstate trade, that it was too much power going to Congress at this point. And this Children's Bureau would try to help kids, get them into education, get them a better life, things like that. But it did help kids, especially kids who were poor, who were struggling. Some, were able to get somewhat of an education, get better working conditions, go to a different factory. But ultimately, it fails to do really anything. It fails to end child labor. Now, you have to understand that Taft, okay, hopefully you got down those two accomplishments. Let's go back to our main box here. Taft proved to be a weak progressive president. He only ends up serving one term in office from 1908 to 1912. He was very unhappy, and he was kind of pushed into the presidency by his wife, who wanted all the glory of being, a first lady, but he hated the job. He was so unhappy that he kept eating and eating and eating, and it's only going to be, after his presidency that he goes on to do what he wanted to do, which was to actually be a judge, be a member of the Supreme Court. And then once he does what he wants, he actually loses 100 pounds. But during this time period, he was very unhappy. He ends up fighting with his buddy, Roosevelt, multiple times. So even though Roosevelt endorsed him and got Republican Americans to vote for Taft, Taft and Roosevelt ended up fighting a lot during Taft's presidency. They fought about a number of things. One of the things they fought about was the environment. And the issue there was that Taft ended up selling some American land to some American oil companies. So those companies could get land, get resources, drill for oil, make money, and obviously then Americans would buy American oil rather than foreign oil. That really wasn't the issue so much back then the way it is today, because remember, Rockefeller did own 90% of America's oil. But that was one of the things that Taft chose to do. Now, Roosevelt criticized him heavily for this, saying that, that's not pro-environment. And Taft said, well, I get to choose what's pro-environment and what's not, what's best for our country, because I'm the president. And so they ended up not getting along in what became known as the Ballinger-Pinchot affair, because the two of them were fighting, over what would happen with these environmental issues. Now, the other issue that Roosevelt and Taft were fighting over was over tariffs. Now, remember, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. And President Roosevelt really did not want high tariffs. High tariffs are good for American businesses, but they're not good for, the common man. And so Roosevelt was against high tariffs. And Taft, he didn't think they were all that bad. So he passes a little bit of a higher tariff than Roosevelt would like, and they fight over it. Roosevelt is publicly calling him names in the newspaper. It turns into this what we call Payne-Aldrich affair, where they're fighting these two different men, Mr. Payne and Mr. Aldrich. And as they're fighting over these tariffs, their relationship just kind of breaks down to the point that in 1912, Roosevelt decides to run for a third term. Now, is it really his third term? Now, that's a whole debatable thing. Remember that technically, Roosevelt was finishing up McKinley's term, then he ran for his own term. So some people would call this Roosevelt's third term, others would say no, this is really only his second term running for office. Well, the election got very complicated because in this election, the Republican Party said, we think Taft has done a good job. Most Americans are happy with him, even though he's stressed out about the job to the point that he's eating all this food. So Taft actually got the Republican nomination for the presidency. And that meant if Taft was the Republican candidate, Roosevelt could not run as a Republican. And so we know that Roosevelt had to create his own political party. So Taft was your Republican candidate. Roosevelt had to create his own political party called the Progressive Bull Moose Party. So when it came to the polls in 1912, Americans who were of the Republican Party didn't know who to vote for. Should they vote for Taft, who according to the ballot was the Republican candidate, or should they vote for Roosevelt, a man that they had loved, who was now known as the Progressive Bull Moose candidate? So Republicans were split over this issue. Since even if 60% of Americans are Republican, if 30% go Taft and 30% go Roosevelt, neither one of those, is going to carry the day, which means the other 40% of Americans are going to vote for Woodrow Wilson. So he gets a higher percentage of the votes and he ends up winning. And this was the first time we saw a Democratic candidate win in years. All right, so let's wrap this up here. So once Woodrow Wilson is in office, let's talk about some of the things that he does. In terms of his domestic policies, he tries to improve business regulations. We mentioned on Monday how the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed. I think we actually talked about this last week, how it was enforcing the earlier Sherman Antitrust Act of the Gilded Age, and it was meant to outlaw monopolies, restore competition between businesses, make sure that there were no trusts. Remember, trusts are bad for the consumer. It means they pay higher prices. He also passed the Underwood Tariff Act, which lowered tariffs or taxes on imported goods for the first time in 50 years. So this is actually something that, President Roosevelt approved of, and obviously Taft disagreed with. So the Underwood Tariff Act helps the common man, doesn't help American businesses. It means that it's very cheap for them to buy foreign-made products made in Britain or China or wherever. So he's making some changes, obviously, because it's a different political party. The most important thing that he does, though, is he helps create a banking system, which we still have to this day, called the Federal Reserve System. And it was meant to help kind of connect America's banks. So he wanted to keep the nation's banking system basically as an independent agency to avoid political perspective influencing monetary policy. What that basically means is he wanted to make sure that there was no talk of like one political party giving loans or support to certain banks throughout the country. He wanted to make sure that all banks kind of followed the same policies. And the Federal Reserve does lots of things. Like if, you write a check and it's going to pay a bill, you give it to the person, they take it to their bank, it gets cashed, they get the cash that you wrote them. But at the same time, that check is then sent back to the Federal Reserve in Chicago, That's our closest one. That's the region that we're out of because there's 12 different regions. And then the money obviously is pulled, out of my checking account, or whoever wrote the check. So the idea was that little local banks were supposed to be getting support from bigger banks in 12 different cities across the country to try to help stabilize them, destroy money that's gone bad, kind of create one financial backing and kind of just create a safer policy. But it's going to run into a few more problems, and we're going to go a lot more into depth on this once we get into the Great Depression and kind of how banks are run then. But for now, just understand that Wilson is really about changing the economic system by lowering tariffs, helping the common man, destroying monopolies, yet again, helping the common man, trying to protect local banks, and that this Federal Reserve System helps stabilize the economy by regulating interest rates, like the amount of money that you would pay to get a loan to buy a house, and the money supply. So he's doing kind of a variety of things. And of course, also during this time period, we see that, the 16th Amendment, which creates a direct income tax, is coming out. So most of his reforms are economic. The political reforms aren't huge during this time, and socially he tries to end child labor, but he's unsuccessful as well. But Woodrow Wilson, of course, is really known for, what happens with World War I, which we'll pick up next semester. All right, guys, give yourself a pat on the back. You are done with notes for this semester. Hooray! What you're going to do now is you're going to watch the president's video on Taft, your last one for this semester. Fill it in. Make sure you filled in all your president notes for each president, wrote down your facts, gave him a rating, why you liked him, all that good stuff, and you click submit. If there's any time left today, get with your group. Make sure your project's all ready for tomorrow. Make sure you've got your note cards, your slides, your biography page. You're going to dress up. You've got all your stuff. Check the rubric. Complete the exit slip. So I know whether I should give you an individual grade or a group grade on the slides. Technically, the slides should be a group grade, but if people didn't pull their weight, it'll be individual. And if you're all done with your project and the exit slip, then you could take a few minutes to work on your review sheet. Remember, you're going to have 15 questions due on Monday, and those will be graded. Those will go into Skyward. But like I said, we will have presentations Thursday and Friday. I'll be there. I'll be ready to present. We're going to do all that stuff, so no worries there. If obviously somebody in your group's out sick because of this flu or whatever's going around, we'll work it out. We may have to move around some groups and such, but we will be presenting Thursday and Friday, kids. All right, email me if you've got questions. Thanks, guys.